In the year 1900 before Christ, in a fertile valley east of the Dead Sea, two cities rose like shining jewels in the heart of the desert: Sodom and Gomorrah. Their towers gleamed under the sun, their streets overflowed with music, wine, and pleasure. There was no modesty, no law. Luxury was the norm. Indulgence was a virtue. The name of God was nothing more than a fading echo in the memories of the old. But the sin of these cities did not remain hidden. From every injustice, every abuse, every act of cruelty, a cry rose up to heaven, and heaven answered. The earth shook. The air turned to fire, and from above, judgment fell. Flames like tongues of wrath descended from the sky. Burning sulfur consumed the homes, the temples, the palaces. The towers split in two, the walls melted like clay, and the ground itself opened to swallow every trace of life. No stone was left upon another. No scream remained unanswered. No ruins, no remains, no graves, only ashes and silence. Thus vanished Sodom and Gomorrah, wiped from the face of the earth by the judgment of the Most High. To this day, no one can say with certainty where they once stood. Only the desert dust keeps their secret. And even now, millennia later, humanity still wonders, what did those people do to deserve such a punishment? What really happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? This is their story. Water flowed down from the mountains, forming rivers that wound through the plains like veins of silver. The breeze, rich with the fragrance of wildflowers, swept across golden wheat fields, swaying the stalks like a golden ocean beneath the rising sun. Fruit trees stood tall with branches heavy with abundance, and vines clung to stone walls, swelling with grapes that burst with sweetness at the slightest touch. The lands of the Jordan were a paradise, a lush garden stretching as far as the eye could see. Thriving cities rose amid that abundance, their streets paved with carved stone, their squares bustling with merchants offering foreign silks, fragrant spices, and gold shaped by skillful hands. In the markets, traders called out their wares with confident voices, while musicians played lyres and flutes to delight those passing by. In the palaces, oil lamps cast a warm glow over endless feasts, where nobles laughed with goblets raised, their hands adorned with rings. The people flourished, harvests never failed, and the flocks multiplied without end. The city walls rose in arrogance, defying both the desert and time itself. Nothing seemed to threaten their greatness. But beneath that appearance of glory, something else was growing in the shadows. Something no walls, no wealth, no abundance could contain. The sun bathed the towers of Sodom in golden light, reflecting off marble rooftops and crystal-clear fountains that adorned the city's squares. The streets were crowded with merchants offering vibrant fabrics, exotic perfumes, and precious stones brought from distant lands. Caravans arrived laden with gold and spices, and the sound of coins changing hands echoed through the markets. The banquets were endless. Tables covered with delicacies stretched across the palaces of the powerful, where wine flowed without limit, and music rose between alabaster columns. In every corner of the city, abundance filled the air. For many, life in Sodom meant a carefree existence, without lack, without worry, without restraint. But beyond the towering walls, beneath the gleaming surface, something dark was growing unchecked. Wealth fed arrogance, and abundance smothered compassion. Strength triumphed over justice, and cruelty had become the norm. Strangers were met with disdain. The poor were stripped of what little they had without remorse. And corruption flowed through the streets like an unstoppable river. There was no law greater than the will of the powerful. There was no restraint for the most unbridled desires. Each day brought new excesses, and each night ended with acts no one dared to question. In Sodom, pleasure knew no bounds, and punishment seemed like a forgotten idea. But the heavens were not silent. Something unseen was moving over the city, something none of its inhabitants could have imagined. The gates of Sodom opened at dawn, and with the light of day came the roar of a city that never slept. Merchants hurried to set up their stalls. Judges took their seats in the courts. Musicians tuned their instruments, and banquet halls prepared for yet another celebration. Every street was alive with movement. Every square echoed with voices of joy. But beneath that appearance of normalcy, corruption had taken root so deeply that no one even noticed it anymore. Justice was sold to the highest bidder. Compassion was seen as foolishness, and truth had become a nuisance few were willing to tolerate. There were no limits to ambition, no restraint on pleasure. The strong crushed the weak without consequence, and greed drove every decision. The elders spoke of a God who once ruled over the earth, but their words were met with laughter. It was said that in ancient times there were laws that brought balance, and that men once walked under the gaze of the Most High. But now, those stories sounded absurd, distant, completely disconnected from the reality of a city governed by its own rules. Temples once built with devotion lay in ruins, or had been turned into banquet halls. Prayers had become forgotten echoes, and what was once sacred was now trampled without remorse. Morality carried no weight, conscience was an obstacle, and reverence for the divine had vanished. The nights unfolded with the same wild abandon that ended each day. In Sodom, every desire was fulfilled, every impulse fed, every boundary erased. The city laughed in arrogance, never imagining that in heaven, judgment was already on its way. Night stretched over Sodom like a cloak of restless shadows. The streets, lit by flickering torches, bore witness to drunken laughter and whispers lost between stone walls. In the squares, feasts carried on without pause, and in the palaces, wine spilled over floors covered in luxurious tapestries. The noise never ceased. Pleasure, greed, and violence ruled the city. From the nearby hills, the glow of Sodom looked like an eternal flame. A city that never slept, a kingdom of men who had built their own throne without fear. There was no shame in their actions, no repentance in their hearts. Right and wrong had lost all meaning. The only law was the will of the strongest. But while men celebrated, something unseen rose above the towers and markets. Something no feast could silence. Something no wealth could buy. A cry not spoken with human lips, yet louder than any shout from the crowd. From every act of injustice, from every abuse of power, from every betrayal, from every cruelty, an echo rose and crossed the heavens. On earth, the oppressors laughed, the innocent suffered in silence, and the arrogant believed themselves untouchable. But in the heights, nothing went unnoticed. The city lived convinced that judgment would never come, that its splendor was eternal, not its sin, that abundance was a right, not a gift, that the sacred could be trampled without consequence. But the cry did not stop, and in heaven, something began to stir. The wind swept over the hills of Canaan, stirring the sand into swirling patterns that vanished as quickly as they formed. Beneath the shade of an oak tree, an old man with a weathered face watched the horizon. His eyes, full of stories, had seen the glory of kings, the fury of the desert, and the promise of a land he did not yet possess. His name was Abraham. He had walked long distances, crossed mighty rivers, and slept beneath star-filled skies, guided by a voice that had called him to leave everything behind. He carried no maps, no deeds to secure his future. His only certainty was the word of the one who had spoken from above, promising that his descendants would be as countless as the dust of the earth. Shepherds tended their flocks on the hillsides, while the tents of his camp stood among the rocks. He had wealth, livestock, and servants, but his true inheritance had not yet been revealed. God had told him he would be the father of nations, yet the years passed, and his wife Sarah remained barren. Still, he did not doubt. He did not complain. He did not demand answers. He walked in the quiet certainty that the promise would be fulfilled, even when everything seemed to say otherwise. One afternoon, as the sun bathed the fields in gold, 3 figures appeared in the distance. They walked with steady steps, unhurried, showing no signs of weariness. Their robes fluttered in the wind, and though the blowing sand veiled their faces, their presence carried a weight unlike any other. They were not like the merchants passing by with their caravans, nor the travelers seeking water at the wells. Abraham narrowed his eyes and without hesitation rose at once. He ran to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He did not ask their names. He did not question their purpose. His heart told him he must honor them, and he did. He asked his wife to knead fresh bread, commanded his servants to choose a tender calf, and ordered milk and butter to be brought. The travelers took their seats under the shade, and as they ate, Abraham stood beside them in silence, waiting. Then one of them looked up and spoke with a voice that cut through the air like a sharpened blade. What he was about to say was no ordinary message. It was a decree. Something had been decided in heaven, and the fate of an entire city hung on every word that would follow. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the smell of dry grass and warm earth. Within the camp, servants moved back and forth, carrying jars of water and trays of roasted meat. Beneath the shade of the largest oak, 3 men sat, eating calmly. Abraham stood beside them, watching their every move with careful attention. There was something in their posture, in the way they spoke to one another, in the quiet authority they carried, that made the air feel different. They were not ordinary travelers. Every gesture conveyed a presence that needed no introduction. Then one of them looked up and spoke in a firm voice. "Next year, when I return to you, your wife Sarah will have a son." From inside the tent, where she thought no one could see her, Sarah listened and covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Her body no longer held the strength of youth, and the long years of waiting had taught her to accept the impossible. A child at her age was nothing more than a distant thought, something she had learned not to hope for. But the voice spoke again, this time with a tone that left no room for doubt. Why does Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? The entire camp seemed to fall still. The air grew heavier, and the heat of the day pressed harder against the skin.